think this is the first time I've seen this scale of waves. A little bit of water in the cockpit. On a lake. So this, you can basically say that these larger lakes are, you know, they're like a small portion of the sea, basically. You can't see this from this angle, but I am actually using the bilge pump with a bit of water that's splashed in. Doesn't look like it's that much, but the bilge pump is working well here. I'm glad I brought it along.
So, what's going on here? What's up with these waves? Why am I in an open kayak, and is this safe? Should paddlers in an inflatable kayak like this, or many other types of kayaks, generally be out in these conditions? Well, the answer in many cases would actually be no, and this was actually something I discussed for the camera just before the weather shift that you see here, when it was calmer. I thought I'd use this patch of a bit of rough weather for a discussion, which might be helpful for other paddlers, especially those using inflatable kayaks, sit on top, or some recreational kayaks, or stand-up paddleboards. This video will include a bit of analysis and specific safety tips that I actually followed here that can keep you safe and prepared for circumstances like this and avoid getting into an unmanageable and dangerous situation on the water. Before we continue, hi there, I'm Patrik from the Air on the Water YouTube channel, which, in case you're not familiar with it, focuses on kayaking, exploring new places around the world, and a lot, in fact, on paddling safety specifically. I'm very experienced in paddling inflatable kayaks and also a dedicated paddling safety advocate, and I'd like to share this example with you as such. This is actually from an eventful kayaking day of mine a few days ago, beginning of June in 2024 on Lake Vättern in Sweden. Vättern is Sweden's second largest lake and is rather significant in size at around 1900 square kilometers and spanning over 120 kilometers, that's over 75 miles, from south to north. This was an amazing paddling day and adventure for me, as I was paddling between places I had never visited before, which I often do in my Paddling in 100 Cities project. But the parts shown in the introduction here were in conditions that turned quickly from, well, basic fun on the water to difficult enough that these conditions would be a really bad idea for many, if not most, inflatable kayakers or many hardshell kayakers to be out in. I've already had some comments from other kayakers who have shared their experience in conditions that suddenly turned rough. And I know that this is an important topic, so I thought this would actually be a really useful real-life example to use for discussion. If you follow this channel, you might remember that I just a few weeks ago, in fact, actually uploaded a video titled Unexpected Weather, or more specifically, when calm weather shifts to heavy and how to be prepared. This paddling trip was a perfect example of that, as even if weather conditions didn't include anything extreme like a thunderstorm or stormy weather or heavy rain or anything like this, the waves that resulted in part from the wind with a kayak like this at least were significant enough that the situation would have been quite uncomfortable or even quite dangerous for many paddlers. And the shift in this case went rather quickly from what was at first a warm or even hot t-shirt paddling day, I would say, because by now the water has warmed up enough that I could actually be in a t-shirt safely, with a little bit of waves and wind, but nothing enough really of too much note For me at least. I mean, I was having fun on the water, with the sun shining through between the clouds and, providing some warmth. In less than half an hour, though, the new situation was stronger wind, increasingly stronger waves, and a new wind direction that wasn't in the weather forecast. This being key because this meant that I had direct wind and strong waves from the side during much of the passage. Chilly air temperatures and full cloud cover, so no longer any warmth from the sun as such. The waves here were significant enough for a couple of hours that it's worth discussion. There are some useful learning points and reminders here, and I'll be including these in the video: how to stay safe and how to stay prepared. Those who know me or follow the Air on the Water channel know that paddling safety is one of the core pillars of the channel, and I often talk about being prepared for different scenarios, bringing the right gear, staying within one's comfort and skill zone, and making informed, safe paddling choices, including always checking the weather forecast and allowing some margin for that. Even that could change beyond what's expected. And this is of course what happened here. So as such, I found this trip to be a really useful example to discuss this a little bit more based on an actual case. So first of all, I am in an inflatable open kayak here. And I mean, this would be different if I was in even an inflatable kayak, but with a closed deck and a spray deck, which I often use. So why was I in this kayak in the first place? Well, what was going on here was that, as I mentioned, this was part of my Paddling in 100 Cities project. And that means that I travel to different places in Sweden, where I live, or in other countries. And in this case, I actually went by train and by bus. And there would be a lot of connections during the day, both when I headed out and when I got back, because this is, a ways away from Stockholm, where I live. So I had chosen to use my Kokopelli Moki Lite kayak, which is an open kayak without any deck or possibility of a spray deck. And the reason why I had chosen this kayak is because it was actually quite feasible given the weather forecast that I saw. I always weigh in, as anybody should, and this is the first advice, make sure if you're going out paddling to be realistic about your abilities and the abilities of your kayak, and then take a look at the weather forecast always. Because even this day, I mean, I knew that it was going to be slightly windy, maybe 5 to 6 meters per second. I knew that it was going to be warm. So my estimate, given that I was actually going to be paddling along land, essentially, was that yes, I did expect to be able to handle definitely those conditions without any problem in an open kayak. But I knew that this was a huge lake, and this lake actually needs to be respected. This and the other large lake, the largest lake in Sweden, unfortunately there have been some casualties there. There have been some accidents where paddlers have actually drowned or lost their lives when they were out in less protected parts perhaps of the lakes, because the weather and the waves, it's a huge lake. It's just like being out at sea. It can escalate massively, far beyond what I encountered here, I suppose. But it's really something that you need to respect. And of course, I did that regardless of how experienced I am in inflatable kayaks. I've already logged almost 2,000 kilometers in inflatable kayaks. So, I know what I'm capable of, and I know what these kayaks can handle. But regardless of what kayak I would have used, whether it would have been a hard shell or an inflatable or a stand-up paddleboard or whatever I was on or in, I would still be checking the same things again, the weather forecast and my ability and the craft I'm on, etc. And in this case, yeah, if the weather stayed with the wind directions that were indicated with the weather forecast, things would have been, just fine. And they were for the first part of the paddle. But again, as this was a huge lake, I was prepared for that this could escalate. I knew that it might actually escalate. And that's where the second part comes in, that you need to actually make safe choices. So in this case, I was suspicious about that it was windy enough and this was causing enough waves already in the areas which were protected, that I realized that, and I recorded notes actually on this towards the camera before this escalated, that this could always get worse. And if it does, I don't want to be too far from land. So when I looked at the map there, in perfectly calm conditions, the shortest route would be just paddling straight from one point to the other across the lakes and maybe being quite far out from land. But that would entail a risk. And if things get worse, then I would be too far from land to really react quickly enough and get to land. So I definitely decided not to do that, and I actively did that, and I recorded that to the camera, that I'm gonna stay safe here, I'm gonna be closer to land, because even if the water is warm enough and etc., that doesn't help me if I'm a kilometer or two out from land. And that's not something you should be. You should stay within a reasonable distance to land, always, depending on which craft you have. And that's a safety assessment you always make, and this is something I made here. And I was, of course, quite right, because what happened was that the weather forecast had the winds from southwest, which would have offered some protection given the amount of land that would kind of stop the wind a bit there. But in this case, the weather forecast wasn't quite correct. The wind shifted to winds from the west, which means that I had it directly without any protection from the side, and also the wind was stronger than the forecast actually had indicated. So all of a sudden, I find myself in a case where, very strong waves sometimes were coming in from the side. And not only that, but even if I stayed near land, which first of all I was happy that I had made the correct choices, even if I stayed near land, there were also rocks in the water, so I had to be aware of that as well, because I could be washed up on those rocks by waves. And this was again, I'm still in an open inflatable kayak, and I had still taking that into account, that I had some margin, in the sense that in the conditions that the weather forecast had, I would definitely be fine. But if things escalated, I knew that I had handled very crazy waters actually in different kinds of even open inflatable kayaks before, and I knew what I could handle. But some of the conditions here, I can say for sure, would not have been okay for many paddlers. Many paddlers would have gotten into real trouble here, because what I had to do quite a lot during an hour there was to kind of keep an eye on the waves, and wherever you would have stronger waves that were notably high, I would have to kind of turn up against the waves every now and then, because otherwise I would have the water splash over my kayak from the side. And because this particular kayak doesn't actually have scupper holes, meaning it can't get rid of the water kind of stays in the kayak, that would mean that I just get flooded. So I managed to avoid that for the most part, but I still got some splash every now and then into the kayak, and enough that actually I had to use my bilge pump eventually when I got to slightly calmer sections. not enough that I was concerned, or actually from where I sat, you couldn't even tell how much water it was. It seemed much less than it was. But once I actually brought the bilge pump out, and that's another piece of advice, that bilge pump, I use it rarely. I mean, I almost never really need it. But in this case, I did. I mean, otherwise I would have at least had to go into shore, and for a long section there, that wasn't really a good option because of the rocks that I could be thrown up on. So I got a bit of water into my kayak, and I did have to keep a keen eye out all the time for those really large waves. But for the most part, for me, this was just, this was fun, this was good exercise. I had been in touch with people on land that knew where I was, and worst case scenario, I could always get to land somehow, and then walk to nearby houses or whatever. It wasn't in the middle of nowhere. But if I hadn't paid attention, and my attention would have been elsewhere, and I was thrown up on one of those rocks, I could have been injured, my kayak could have been damaged. And for sure, if I didn't keep an eye on the strongest of the waves, that would have been a bad situation. So what can we learn from this? Well, again, I'm not a great example in this case because, my safety margins or my capacity level is higher than many people who sit in an inflatable kayak or a sit on top, or imagine being out in this on a stand-up paddleboard. That would have been a nightmare for most paddlers, I would say. Having that wind and those waves from the side, that simply wouldn't have been feasible for other than really skilled paddlers. So I adapted to my experience level, and I dealt with this, having mostly fun, but I had to focus actually during some sections. I was realizing that if I didn't focus, it was gonna be a dangerous situation, potentially. But for many paddlers, for most people, I would say that, for example, begin with an inflatable kayak or a sit-on-top hardshell kayak or something like this, or a stand-up paddleboard, getting into circumstances like this could be really dangerous because it takes some skill level to actually be able to deal with it. It should be mentioned that an inflatable kayak like the one I'm using is extremely stable because of the air tubes on the side, and that's part of the equation here. If you were out in an unstable kayak and you got hit by some of these waves that were quite high from the side, that would have been bad as well. And trying to perform a self-rescue while you're being pushed to land, not a good idea. So that's something to take into account as well. Basically, what I was saying was, take into account what you are actually able to handle, and then, like I had here with the weather forecast, go out according to the weather forecast and those conditions, but be prepared for that the weather could get worse than what the forecast says. The waves could get worse, the wind could get worse, just like it did here. It totally changed the paddling experience. And if you're not prepared for this, then that's a bad situation to be in. And that comes to basically good judgment. Be prepared for that things could happen that are outside of your plan. And if you see that there's a risk that could happen, then be more conservative, just like I was. Don't go as far from land, and check the map for potential spots where you could get to land and take a break and wait for the wind to subside, or just stay on land or go to a nearby community or whatever if things go wrong. So, or if things get too difficult. So that was the situation here. And the other thing is, when I started this paddle, I felt, it was really, really warm. It was, in theory, it wasn't that warm. It was maybe 21, 22 degrees Celsius, which isn't that warm. But the sun was really shining down on me, and it was warm. It was nice and warm, almost too warm. And I was just in a t-shirt. But as I've talked about in many videos, you have to be prepared for that can change. And this was a really good example, one of the best I've experienced in summer, so to speak, in early summer, that when that weather shift came, all of a sudden the sun was hidden behind the clouds, and I was in my paddling jacket that I added, that I obviously had with me, in a dry bag, needing extra warmth, because all of a sudden it was really cold, even when I was on land, because of the wind and because, the sun wasn't visible anymore. It was behind the clouds. So all of a sudden it was chilly and it was windy, and I could feel some of the wind gusts that came. They were really strong at times. The base wind was still not that strong, maybe 7-8 meters per second at most. But the wind gusts at some point, you could feel them in your body very clearly, actually, that in a way that you don't do during many paddles. So having those spare clothes, I needed just to add a jacket on land to stay warm during my lunch. But going out again, if I had been paddling in a t-shirt, I would have been miserable. That would have been so cold and so much of a diminishing factor for my capacity, because I would have been freezing and I would have needed that energy for paddling instead of dealing with being cold. So obviously having spare clothes along is key. You should always have that in a dry bag if it's at all feasible based on where you're paddling, so that if you also end up in the water for some reason, or you get splashed and you're wet and you're cold, you have a change of clothes, actually. And you have clothes that, like my paddle jacket here, that can actually withstand water splash or rain or waves or whatever, because that is not something that you want to realize, that even my spare clothes are now getting wet, and all of a sudden they are not helping me either. So basically being prepared for a capsize, ending up in the water, and having spare clothes, and preferably something that can deal with rain or wave splash or whatever, if necessary, that's always a good choice. And then of course, I wouldn't have made the same choices here if this was cold water. In cold water conditions just a month earlier, I would have been in a dry suit. I would have been maybe taking another kayak even. So those are also conditions that you need to check. If the water is cold but the air is hot, as I always say, you dress for immersion, you dress for the water temperature. So if the water is cold, or the colder the water is, the more safety layers you need to add. So in this case, this was nothing crazy, but many paddlers would have really found this really difficult or potentially dangerous. And some of those highest waves that we saw that washed up in one side or towards one side or the other really could have, if I wasn't paying attention, flipped even a kayak that is stable like this. The other thing is that I would have made different choices and been even more conservative if the wind direction had been in the other direction. This is a key factor as well for anyone going out in any kayak that is vulnerable to wind. That goes for inflatable kayaks, that goes for stand-up paddle boards, and it goes for some recreational kayaks and such, especially. So if the wind was pushing me out from land onto the lake, that would have been really dangerous, of course, because it's 20 kilometers over to the other side. It's and I would have been pushed out towards even rougher water. That could have been really bad. So if the wind is actually pushing you out from land, you might want to choose to go in safer spots to change your paddling location entirely, or you might want to stay very close to land and make sure that the conditions don't go over what you're able to paddle in. But if you're all of a sudden surprised by even stronger wind or tides, and you're actually being pushed out from land and you find yourself unable to get back in, this happens especially with stand-up paddle boards, that is that is not a good situation. So that's something you need to take into account. If you have winds that push you offshore, then you need to be aware of whether you can realistically deal with that or not on the craft that you're using. So those are a few things to think about. And then of course, wearing a PFD is key, a life jacket, a life vest, something that will help keep you afloat if you actually were to end up in the water. And of course, that's something I always do during every single paddle trip. Doesn't matter how warm or how close to land I am or how calm these waters are. I've been in a really dangerous situation, which I will talk about some other time. The most dangerous, in fact, situation I've been in, that was on calm, warm water, absolutely flat, calm water, on a tiny, tiny lake on a hot summer day. And I was enormously grateful for my PFD and the support it gave me in that situation. I'll talk about that another time, but wear your PFD. That is, even if the weather is warm. So this paddle was, I think, a good example of, things that can change quickly. They can change quickly, and you should be prepared for it. I had a blast during this trip. I saw a castle, I saw a canal ferry, I saw racing sail crafts, and I had these waves to play around with, and I visited this castle, and I visited 2 new cities, and the Göta Canal, which is a famous canal in Sweden, which I had never paddled before. I saw so much and experienced so much, and it was all great. But let's imagine for a moment that I hadn't made the right choices, in the sense that I would have been further out from land, much further out from land, and then all of a sudden this happens. That could have been bad. I could have ended up in the water, worst case, and had a hopeless kind of long swim to shore. Even if I was pushed in by the waves, it would have been dangerous potentially. And if I hadn't had those reinforcement clothes with me, waterproof paddle jacket, for example, my experience would have been miserable, regardless of my experience, regardless of if I could handle the waves or not. If I hadn't brought my bilge pump, I had a sponge, but that doesn't help at all in these kind of conditions. If I hadn't had my bilge pump along, which I almost never use, I never need to use it almost, other than, during re-entry exercises and such, practicing getting back into your kayak, which you should, by the way. If I hadn't had that, then I would have been only reliant on being able to get to land, and obviously for a long stretch here, that wasn't an option really. So having that bilge pump along was key. So again, one might say, why were you out in these waters at all with an open kayak? Well, according to the weather forecast, etc., it was perfectly within my capacity and the craft's capacity. But I had noted correctly that things could escalate further, and then I would still be able to handle quite a bit up from that if things got worse, which I was able to do here. But, I wouldn't have been going out on open waters in a different sense with this kind of kayak, for example. So you always make those decisions, and those decisions might save your life or that of paddlers around you. As a group, or that's obviously always best. I'm solo kayaking here, but I'm also very experienced in paddling these kind of crafts, and I do paddle alone, but I'm extremely safety aware, so I make those judgment calls all the time. But it's usually better to go with a group, and then you also need to be aware of the capacities of your teammates, the other people in the group. Who's the weakest paddler and what's their capacity, and are people able to get back in their kayak or help others get back in their kayak? Have you practiced this? Do they have the right gear, etc.? You need to be aware of that as well. But there are a lot of things to think about. So in summary, some learning points here. Again, number 1, choose your paddle route and your paddle plan, where you're going to paddle and how you're going to paddle, based on your skill level and the capacity of your craft and the weather forecast. So basically the expected conditions, and take into account tides and any obstacles and boat traffic and things that might affect your paddle safety wise. Then be prepared for that the weather forecast might not give the whole story like it didn't here. Things could get worse than you expected, and then you need to think about, do I have margin for if things get a bit worse? If you're just about at the margin of where you think you're able to handle this, I mean, you're exactly on the outer edge of that, then that's probably not a good situation, because if things get even worse, you're not prepared for the extra difficulty. So always keep a safety margin and be prepared for that things can change quickly, and bring the right gear. As we said, obviously always wear a PFD. Bring your waterproof clothing if you think you might need it, I mean, based on rain or whatever. But in any case, spare clothes in a dry bag is usually a good idea. Even like this on a warm day, I really needed that paddle jacket, for example, and I had extra layers prepared, obviously. And then things like having a whistle on your PFD and having your phone in a waterproof pouch on your PFD, preferably. So if you're ending up in the water or whatnot, you're able to call for help, and you don't all of a sudden realize that your phone and your possibilities to call for help just floated away with the kayak. That's meaningless, to have your phone connected to your kayak and you lose your kayak and then you're helpless. I would advise everybody to have a waterproof pouch with their phone on their PFD. And then again, take into account these risks and make educated decisions, like I in this case chose not to paddle that far from land. As I said, I really changed my paddle route. It took me longer to paddle the way I did now. Going straight would have been much faster, but that wasn't a safe option or safe enough option, I felt, if things got crazier weather-wise, which it did. And that wasn't in the forecast, but I had anticipated that it could change, and it was a large lake and things could really escalate, and they did. So my choices were correct. And then again, be prepared for things like you could have rocks in the water. I had a lot of rocks in the water, even when it was a bit calmer, that you had to really look out for. You don't want to be damaging your kayak or be thrown up on them, onto them, in case you have strong waves coming from the side or wherever, pushing you onto those rocks. That's a bad situation. And ultimately, as we said, be particularly mindful of if your wind direction is pushing you away at any point from land. Then you need to be aware of, are there land obstacles later on that will stop you, so to speak? If you get blown out from land, will you be stopped by the next island so that you can't really end up in a really bad situation? Or, like in this case, are you at risk of being pushed far out on open water? That is a really dangerous, potentially life-threatening situation, especially for stand-up paddleboarders, which are particularly vulnerable to wind. So if you have winds that are headed offshore, then you need to make smart decisions. If you're in an inflatable kayak, then maybe make changes to your paddle plan so you are not that exposed. Always take that into account. And as we said, if you can, paddle with others. If you're solo kayaking, then you need to be especially aware of your abilities. You need to be able to get back in your kayak. Fortunately for me, with this kind of kayak, it's fairly easy to re-enter, actually. These conditions would have been challenging because of the side waves pushing me and being close to land, etc., etc. There was a different complexity to it. But even so, on open water, so to speak, I would have been able to re-enter into the kayak, I expect, without much difficulty, because it's really easy to get back into this particular kind of kayak. And be aware of, again, your craft's capacity. So in this case, okay, it's an open kayak, but it's a hugely stable kayak, and I am able to control it and maneuver and deal with it, and I can anticipate waves and balance and such and such. If I don't have that experience, if I'm newer or intermediate as a paddler, and I don't really know what I can handle, then it's always better to be conservative and play it safe and be closer to land and deal with what you know that you can deal with. So that's basically it. And finally, as we said, leave a paddle plan with someone on land, so they know when you start and they know when you'll get back. And if you don't get in touch, after a long paddle, then someone can call for help, actually, and start a rescue mission if necessary, if you're not checking in and you're expected to. So yeah, this wasn't hugely crazy. I mean, if you're looking at this and you're a sea kayaker, and you're experienced in a good sea kayak and dealing with waves of all kinds, that would have been different. It would have been different for me as well. I mean, I would have had more of a balance issue inside of some of the side waves, but I would have been protected by a spray skirt. And even in my Ituit X500 inflatable kayak, for example, I would have had a spray skirt to protect me, and a closed deck. But even so, you always deal with the craft that you're in on that day. And in this case, I was out in this particular kayak, not really made for these conditions. I happen to have the capacity to deal with conditions that are beyond what the kayak normally functions in. But if you're not that experienced, then yeah, be more mindful of what, stay in the conditions that a kayak is for. So yeah, this was kind of a don't do this at home video, in the sense of if you don't have the experience enough, you should be on calmer waters. But I wanted to mostly show what could happen if you are in a really, manageable situation at first, and then all of a sudden the wind direction shifts, or the wind increases and the waves increase, and all of a sudden you're in a different paddling circumstance altogether. So be prepared for that. Think about when you're going out planning and your paddle, and if you have questions or suggestions, you're welcome to share them here in the comments. And there's also a paddling safety section on the first page of this YouTube channel, Air on the Water, where you can find a lot of safety videos, and there are more coming. So stay tuned there. You can learn a lot about paddling in different conditions, and you're welcome to share your experience in comments on any video. And as such, this was a long video, but I thought this was interesting enough. I know there was a bit of discussion about it, given the size of the waves at times, and of course most of the waves weren't that extreme. I mean, most of the waves were quite manageable. It was just every now and then you would get these fairly huge waves, and for this kayak at least. But then again, you have sea kayakers going out and 2.5 meter waves, enormous waves higher than that, if you have the skill for it. So this, in many cases, this might be considered by an experienced kayaker in the right kayak not to be a big deal at all. And for me, actually, it wasn't that big a deal. It was just enough that I needed to focus and pay attention. But if it had been worse, if it had been larger waves still, and I would have been further out somehow, etc., it could have been a real risk, even for me. And even if you're in conditions you can manage, you can always have some strange thing happen that throws you off, steals your attention for a while, and you could still get in trouble, regardless of your experience. I had, for example, a cloud of mosquitoes that all of a sudden appeared out of nowhere, and really took all my attention at that moment. So even if I was on calmer waters right then, I mean, I could easily have hit a rock or something because I was just dealing with the mosquito clouds, and my glasses were sort of filling up with mosquitoes and whatever. So you never know. You have stuff happen that you don't expect, and that's part of being out on the water. Just respect it, make safe and responsible choices, and usually you'll be just fine. Bring the right gear, plan well, stay safe in your mindset, through your mindset, and then you'll have a lot of fun on the water. And this is what I had here. I had a fantastic day. I mean, this was so much to see and experience and new places, and I enjoyed myself. Even in the worst of waves there, I really enjoyed myself a lot. I mean, it was good practice with this kind of kayak. This particular kayak, it was the most waves that I had dealt with that kayak, so it was fun to see how I could deal with it. But again, with a bilge pump at the ready. So, well, again, this has been a long little monologue about this particular day, but I know that this can be helpful for some. Hopefully this has given some thought to somebody in terms of maybe making a paddle trip safer or whatnot. In all cases, thank you very much for watching. Regardless of your experience level and whatever kayak or stand-up paddleboard or whatever you're paddling, you're most welcome to share your thoughts and experience and maybe trips you've been out on where the weather shifted on the water, and leave that in the comments here. And finally, again, I made a video a couple of weeks ago just on this exact topic. That things can change quickly, so if you're interested, I'll leave a link here. It's a much shorter video, and that could be fun to see as well. So or useful. That has more direct information on what you should think about. So again, as I always say, stay safe and happy paddles. Thank you for watching.